Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. Qualifying for the Japanese Grand Prix in Suzuka, always a highlight to see these Formula One cars on a lap of this racetrack. Nevertheless, it was certainly a bit sobering for the neutral Formula One fan, as Red Bull once again showed who is the master of the house. The front row of the grid goes completely to the Bulls, but we'll talk about them in more detail in a moment. First of all, let's take a closer look at a problem child, namely Charles Leclerc. If you've seen his gestures and facial expressions over the last few days, then you know what's going on. He's just not really happy. He only finished 8th in qualifying, while teammate Carlos Sainz was 4th. Yes, there was only a 10th of a second between the two, but it's still a trend that's emerging. I was heavily criticized by some of you after the last driver ranking. Why did I give Charles Leclerc a 3 even though he finished directly behind his teammate? I explained at the time, well, Sainz is back after a week's break, or has come back after a 2-week break. He missed the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, and missing a race so early in the season is anything but ideal. You still have to learn the car, and we all know how he was physically, and then to beat Leclerc so clearly in qualifying, then not so clearly in the race either, but still finish ahead of him. Well, for me, that was simply not a good performance from Charles Leclerc, and it wasn't a one-off. At the start of the season in qualifying, he beat Carlos Sainz for the only time. Then in the race, the order was reversed. Well, there were technical problems. But Sainz still finished ahead of Leclerc, then in Australia for the second time, and now apparently again. Carlos Sainz, yes, he once again got the maximum out of the Ferrari, but Charles Leclerc did not. I said there was only a 10th of a second between the two of them, but it's been apparent all weekend. In Q1, Leclerc even had to go out twice, sacrificing 2 fresh sets of soft in order to progress safely. Of course, that cost him a bit in the end, so he only had 1 attempt, which Ferrari did very cleverly by driving anti-cyclically in Q3. So, in that respect, at least he made the most of the circumstances. If you look at Leclerc's face now, you just see this helplessness. He said that normally when he finishes 8th, he knows what the problem is, but now he just does not know. The car just didn't give it anymore. That was the maximum. There was no mistake of any kind on this lap. The balance was fine. It just didn't work anymore. And these are statements that you don't particularly like to hear from a racing driver. There is just this helplessness in them, but he has a starting point where he thinks that could be it. He believes that the tire preparation, i.e. the outlap, was the decisive factor in why he couldn't quite catch up with his teammate. He also believes that this was already a bit of a problem in the races before, but yes, he definitely has to get a grip on it now. It's not entirely new, to be fair. Last year, Leclerc also had a small phase of weakness, but then he came back stronger with the update, which came at the Japanese Grand Prix. From then on, things went really well for him, so maybe all he needs is an initial spark and he will come back. In any case, the starting position is now much better, once again for the man who was kicked out, for Carlos Sainz, who has to leave the team at the end of the year, and Charles Leclerc, the great hope who remains in the team, only in 8th position. At Red Bull, there's almost a really big surprise. Sergio Perez in 2nd position, just 0.66 seconds behind the world champion, behind Max Verstappen. And now you might think I'm evil because I called it a surprise, but if you look at the statistics a little more closely, it really is. For the first time since Miami last year, Sergio Perez has managed to get onto the front row of the grid under his own steam. Yes, in Belgium, in Spa, he also started the race from the front row, but there he benefited from a penalty. So that shows that Perez always had really big problems in qualifying, but was then able to work his way back in the race. Now this year things are looking a bit better for him. Even in Australia he had a decent qualifying, then he got the penalty, but you can see a clear upward trend, and he says himself that he no longer experiments so much with the setup and then just gets into the driving and it goes much better. Some people even believe that Perez could have won pole position with such a small gap. He was not held up on his last lap, but was at least a little bit irritated by George Russell before the final chicane. We took a closer look. Perez actually had to hit the brakes a little earlier than before. He could have lost a 10th of a second. Yes, you can always say that in hindsight. Would have, could have, should have, as a great German philosopher once said. But if we look at Verstappen's laps, we also have to say that both of his Q3 laps would have been enough for pole position in the end, and Verstappen's laps show something that is very symptomatic of this racetrack in Suzuka, because if you gain time at the beginning and push the tires a little too hard, then you lose it again at the end. And Verstappen was already 0.2 of a second faster on his second Q3 lap than before, but in the end it was only, well, not even 0.5 of a second, because he lost it all after Spoon, where the front tyres gave up, went into understeer, then lost almost 0.1 of a second between Spoon and the chicane, and then added almost another 0.1 of a second in the chicane up to the finish line. That's why there was only a minimal improvement for him, and of course that shows that Perez has improved a lot over this entire lap. But of course he also pushed the tyres a bit harder, and that's why it's a bit unfair to say that without Russell he might have taken pole position. But it was also a bit atypical for Max Verstappen. Why? 5th pole position in a row, he's never managed that before. 5 pole positions in a row, not really his specialty, or not the specialty of the RB19 or RB20 if you like, but it just works for him, but it works less well in the race. That's a bit of a fear at Red Bull and the hope of the neutral Formula One fan. We haven't seen the long runs so far this weekend. Yes, FP2. They didn't look particularly good, and they also tried again in FP3, and Verstappen was once again not satisfied. He did say that, yes, maybe we now know a bit better what the problem was. They made changes to the car. You can still do that before qualifying, then Parc Fermé rules, and he believes that things can go better there. But overall, he is still very, very dissatisfied with the long-run performance. And you certainly read it yesterday on our website, big practice analysis from FP1. There are always the long-run times, and Ferrari really looked stronger than Red Bull, but now the first competitor is only in 4th and 8th. Can Ferrari do anything from there? Carlos Sainz says, it doesn't matter at all. Red Bull is only deceiving and camouflaging anyway, i.e. sandbagging on those long runs earlier in the weekend. They run with significantly more fuel, and that's why they look better there. He believes they have no chance at all against Red Bull Racing, even in race trim. Even if Ferrari has tended to get better there than in the past, Red Bull is still in a league of its own. Is this the final confirmation that Australia was a complete outlier and that Max Verstappen would have won the race anyway if he hadn't had the defect? Sainz says no, this is specific to Suzuka. This track is tailor-made for the RB20. The Ferrari just doesn't fit so well there. Nothing will work without a major update, but on other tracks such as Miami, Monza, Singapore, Sainz still reckons he has a better chance. One chance you might think would be another defect on the Red Bull side. They've been a bit secretive about what exactly happened in Australia 2 weeks ago. Was there a defect in the brake caliper or not? There are indications that it was actually human error, that a small mistake was made during assembly, because Verstappen also said, well, they have already made changes to the whole procedure. Everyone is now looking over it again. In the hectic pace of a race weekend, changes may be made to the setup. So there are a few changes to the procedure. So the competition should probably have little hope in this respect. However, there is perhaps still a little hope at the front due to the strategy. Lando Norris in 3rd position, the McLaren. Once again, it suits this racetrack, the gap. It wasn't gigantic, and that's why it's perhaps a mini hope if something is still possible strategically, because unlike Red Bull, McLaren still has 2 sets of hard tires in stock, and then it can actually be very interesting because the soft tires, they are actually not to be completely neglected in the race trim in Suzuka. The softs are significantly faster on a lap, 1 to 1.2 seconds, according to Pirelli's calculations today. And that could tempt 1 or 2 drivers to perhaps choose the soft tires for the first stint at the start, maybe even make up places in the first few laps, and then McLaren can go on hard twice. If you start on the soft, of course this strategy is a bit riskier, but it could possibly work out to at least beat a Red Bull. So I'm really looking forward to the strategy tomorrow. That's a real treat. It's looming. A real treat is, of course, our print edition, and maybe you already have it, but your loved ones don't have it yet. So as always, there is the opportunity to buy a voucher at gutshine.motorsport-magazin.com. Important to say, if you give this voucher as a gift, you're not giving away this print magazine for life and have to hope that the recipient cancels it at some point. No, you are giving it for a year. By the way, now is your chance to get issue number 95. We are already in the hot phase for issue number 96. Yes, technical development in the 2024 Formula One season has now also reached the hot phase, and this weekend we saw some major updates again. For example, a new cooling intake at Red Bull, but the biggest update came from Aston Martin. On Friday, initially only on Lance Stroll, then overnight they broke the curfew to install the update on Fernando Alonso's car as well. There was a reason why it was only used on Stroll. He had damaged his chassis a bit with his crash in Saudi Arabia, so they had to bring his chassis back anyway, then they could prepare the chassis for the update. On Alonso's car, it happened overnight. You can see it's a major conversion work because they also had to break the curfew. The update includes a completely new floor, and it's not just a bit different, it's quite different. There are also new side pods, a new beam wing, so it's quite massive what they've done with it. And Fernando Alonso thanked him with 5th place on the grid. A strong performance from the Asturia once again, especially when you compare it with his teammate who didn't get on at all, only 16th on the grid for Lance Stroll. So now, of course, you ask yourself the question, did the update perhaps not work so well for him, but the data showed it on Friday? Otherwise, the Alonso car wouldn't have been converted to this specification. Fernando Alonso says, however, that this is not our actual position. Especially in race trim, we are always a bit behind, so he expects to be passed by the Mercedes, by Charles Leclerc, by Oscar Piastri, so he is still a bit low. Haas was also in deep doo-doo before qualifying, but Nico Hülkenberg made it. Not only did he make it into Q2, he even finished 12th, which Haas hadn't expected at all before qualifying. The briefings beforehand said, well, it could be that we lose both cars in Q1, but Nico Hülkenberg made it. With Kevin Magnussen, they used a slightly different strategy. He had even bigger problems than Hülkenberg so far this weekend, so they said maximum what is only somehow possible in Q1. So he even drove 3 attempts, tried 3 fresh tires. Nico Hülkenberg left it at 2 and got further. The secret was perhaps a little bit the setup, because in the first sector, the Haas disadvantage is relatively big. In the first sector, in the whole SS, it's simply downforce that counts. The Haas really isn't the best car there. They lost a lot of time there too, but they put an even smaller wing on it. Of course, that's counterproductive in the first sector, but in the last sector, you can make up a lot of ground on the long straight, and that could also be quite interesting in the race, perhaps giving you a slightly better opportunity to overtake. Incidentally, Haas is not the only team that has opted for a smaller wing at the back of the midfield. There's also Williams, for example, which has realized that we've had a bit too much wing on it in the last few races. So now there are fewer wings. The others have chosen a different approach. Alpine and Sauber, for example, significantly larger wings. So I'm curious to see where Haas will be positioned again in the race. Maybe there will be points for Ayao Komatsu's squad for the 3rd time in a row. In the end, I would like to say thank you very much for your numerous wishes for recovery in the last videos, and also via private messages. Thank you very much. Of course, I have read them all. You shouldn't necessarily read them now. Of course, you can. You can listen to something now, namely our new podcast. Perhaps you've already noticed that we're trying to give you a bit more to listen to. Issue number 3 is here, and it's about Sebastian Vettel, among other things. Will he be racing again, possibly at Le Mans, in a top car, or maybe even returning to Formula One? My colleagues talked about it in the new podcast. It's brand new. It's only issue number 3. Let us know what you think about it. You can listen to the podcasts on all the podcast channels out there, or watch them here on YouTube with a wonderful visual in the background over on our partner channel, Motorsport-Magazin Talk.